Index Astartes, word bearers, heralds of unwelcome truths. While the Imperium worships the Emperor as a god, and the legions remain silent in order to preserve order, the sons of Lorgar remember the words of the Master of Mankind. Like most of their cousins, they do not believe in his divinity. But unlike them, they make no secret of their distaste for the ecclesiarchy and the imperial cult. The reason for this attitude takes its roots in the Legion's distant past, and over millennia has been the source of much conflict between the word bearers and the rest of the Imperium. Yet the sons of Colchis remain steadfast in the face of adversity, the imperial truth remaining ever foremost in their thoughts. As they did during the Great Crusade, they fight to purge the darkness of ignorance and superstition, while the flame of illumination, a spark of pure light, amidst the shades of grey. Their eyes, unshrouded by blind belief, has exposed more than one traitor hiding beyond honeyed words, and none were more foul than the one who almost brought the Imperium down during the infamous Reign of Blood. Origins: the wars, because there are more. The Wars of the False Priests. Of all the sons of the Emperor, none can be said to have embodied the ideals of the Great Crusade more than Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the 17th Space Marine Legion. His heart beat with the melody of the Imperial Truth. His words were charged with its persuasion, and his blows inhabited by its powers. There are few archives concerning the youth of Lorgar that have survived the passing of years. This might be surprising, for Lorgar was known for his unflinching loyalty to the Emperor, and one could be forgiven for presuming only traitor Primarchs would have their history secreted. The reason for this treatment partially lies in the complex and often conflicted relationship between the word bearers and the rest of the Imperium, but also exists for the sake of the entire Imperium. For the world of Colchis, where Lorgar was cast off, wasn't always the model of imperial loyalty and productivity that it is today. Still, the Inquisition has its own data vault, hidden beyond the reach of even the most vengeful ecclesiarch or fanatical Puritan. And there is recorded the days when Lorgar, son of the Emperor of Mankind, came to Colchis, and what he saw and did there until his father found him. It is a tale of dedication to higher ideals, selfless heroism when confronted to the depths of human depravity, and defiance in front of impossible odds, all in the name of what the young man believed was right. Colchis was a planet located in Segmentum Pacificus, and one of the first worlds settled by mankind during the first wave of human colonization, had endured the horrors of Old Night well. As the warp storms hold over the galaxy receded with the birth of the dark god Slanesh, many traces of their passage remained upon this arid world. The atrocities that had been visited upon by the people of Colchis by demonic hordes and unbound psychers left deep marks within the collective psyche, and the writings left behind by these dark times had become the basis of a fate that held the entire planet in its suffocating grasp. According to the preachers of this belief system, only by offering sacrifices to the powers dwelling in the Sea of Souls could humans be spared from their wrath, and the faithful be rewarded with power, knowledge, and immortality. This religion called itself the Covenant, for its priests believed that sacrifices had to be made to appease the greater powers ruling the galaxy. To us, it's obvious that the Covenant was nothing more than a cult dedicated to the dark gods of chaos, its priests traitors to mankind. But the people of Colchis, these priests held great power, both temporal and spiritual. Legions of fanatics did their bidding, and some of them were invested of strange, otherworldly powers, which they used to keep the population cowed. However, to the outside eye, there were few signs as to the true nature of the fate. There were no demons walking the streets, and the sacrifices took place behind closed doors. Most of the Covenant's ranks were filled with truly devout men and women who wanted nothing more than to aid those under their responsibility. be it by offering assistance to the poor, healing the sick, and spiritual advice to the distressed. But the higher ones progressed into the Covenant's hierarchy, the deeper the corruption became, as the true nature of the powers the Covenant prayed to was slowly revealed. The archpriests, who each stood at the head of their own religional sect of the Covenant, were minor chaos lords in their own right, and often waged war against one another, driving their followers before them to die in order to satiate their petty grudges. Every settlement on Colchis had a graveyard filled with empty graves of those who had fallen in these so-called holy wars. These highest ranking of priests hid the truth from their followers, instead spouting rhetorical nonsense and constant reminders to obey the Covenant in order to maintain their hold over the planet. There is no doubt that had the people of Colchis be aware of the true nature and allegiance of their priestly masters, they would have risen against their rule long before they eventually did. The lifepod of Lorgar crashed near one of Colchis' farming villages, far from the great cities and temples to the old gods. The villagers believed the falling star to be a sign of their cruel divinities, were terrified, and most of them refused to go anywhere near the site of impact. Only an old couple went to investigate and found a baby that would become their salvation, or would become the salvation of their people amongst the wreckage. Miraculously, unharmed, who would have thought? We know little of these two humans, not even their names, but what we know is enough. We know that they had children of their own, who had gone to fight in the wars of the rival priests and died without achieving anything. We know that they paid lip service to the bloody rituals of the ruling priests, but did not truly embrace their dark tenets. We know that when they saw the golden child, they vowed to protect him from any who would do him harm. They brought the infant back with them and named him Lorgar, the name of one of the greatest heroes of Colchis legends, who had fought against the infernal tides during the Old Night. The Covenant had struggled to rewrite the legend of that warrior, to erase the traces of his defiance and make him a figure who had been amongst the first to kneel before the dark powers and offer them worship. But the fragments of the truth remained, passed on through the generations around fires, where the priests and their cronies couldn't hear. Lorgar was raised in isolation from the rest of the villagers. The old couple had been slowly ostracized by their brethren. Without children to care for them, they would have eventually starved to death. This was not out of callousness, but necessity. On the harsh world of Colchis, where crops were difficult to raise and taxation from the Covenant was high, there could be no burden to the collectivity. "Why are you crying, Dad?" Instead of replying, Lorgar's father rose from his chair and hugged him. Despite his advanced age, there was still strength left in him. But Lorgar was careful not to hurt him, nonetheless, as he returned the hug. He had learned long ago that he was far stronger than his father. After a long time, his foster father said, "I was remembering them, our children, those who came before you. I was remembering how they died. They were taken, Lorgar, one by one, taken from us, taken from life, all for nothing in the end, just because some priest told them to. Promise me, son," asked the old man, his voice on the verge of breaking. "Promise me you will not join them. Promise me you won't let yourself be lied to as they were." "I promise," replied the golden child. But Lorgar grew quickly, far more quickly than any normal child should, and his adoptive parents soon realized that while they had always suspected his more than human origins, they had underestimated just how great the difference was. In just a few years, Lorgar was able to work in the fields, taking care of the harvest and the few goats the old couple still had. Then, on the 10th year, a new holy war was declared by the local archpriest against one of his rivals. Militia troops were sent to every settlement to round up those who were of age. Mere weeks before the recruiters came to his village, Lorgar's foster parents had died peacefully in their sleep, both going into the afterlife in the very same night. The young Primarch buried them and then journeyed to the village, where he was found by the recruiters and immediately forced into joining them. Obviously, Lorgar could have resisted, and there wouldn't have been much they would have been able to do. But Lorgar was young, and did not know his true strength, and had no reason to doubt their words about the righteousness of their cause. That was until he joined with the gathering army, and for the first time in his life was exposed to the Covenant, when he heard the Archpriest speak to the troops he had gathered for his own personal war. "And so you must fight, my children," shouted the priest, clad in his rich robes, his voice reaching to the furthest ranks of the assembled soldiers. "You must fight to prove your value to the gods, so that you might be rewarded in the afterlife with eternal joy as one of the faithful." The crowd roared its unthinking approval, their blood made hot by the words reacting to a lifetime of conditioning. Only one remained silent, a giant of a man standing in the very center of the army, wearing a simple tunic and holding a sword that appeared comically small in his hands. That man stared at the priest, but there was no zeal in his eyes, no burning joy, no submission, only horror and anger battling for supremacy. The giant started to march forward, breaking the ranks. Before him, the other soldiers parted way instinctively. Soon he arrived at the front of the army, but he did not stop. He climbed up on the small hill atop of which the priest had made his speech, his legs propelling him up with the same momentum of an avalanche. Soon the priest's guards noticed him, and they raised their spears hesitantly in the direction of this intruder. The crowd went silent as he brushed the weapons aside and kept going on, not even sparing a glance to the guardians. The priest saw him then, and something akin to terror flashed in his face. Staring down at the priest, Lorgar looked into the eyes of the old man who had commanded the 5,000 young men and women to go to their death for the glory of the gods he served. He looked into the soul of the one who claimed to speak for the heavens, and then spoke a single word. Liar. Something happened then, though what exactly isn't clearly known. Lorgar ousted the archpriest and took command of the gathered army instead. What had been just another army to be used as cannon fodder for the endless feuds between the Covenant's leaders instead became an instrument of Kolk's liberation. On the night following his public humiliation of the archpriest, Lorgar went into the deposed warlord's tent and there found the books and journals he had kept. Lorgar had never learned to read, but it only took him a few hours before he could decipher the ancient scripts used in these texts. When he emerged from the tent again, his rage was visible to all, barely contained from exploding. Lorgar had learned the secrets that the archpriest kept hidden from the population. He had read the reports of human sacrifices, the hidden motives behind every holy war, and the true face of the gods the Covenant served. In the grand speech, Lorgar denounced the Covenant as a fraud, a grand deception orchestrated by the enemies of mankind. He vowed to bring the entire organization down in flames and purge Kolkis of its pernicious influence. He swore that he would see every last temple razed and every priest either defrocked or slain. And so began the wars of the false priests that would rage across Kolkis for several decades. City after city fell to the rebel army of Lorgar. Some cities were liberated by the words of Lorgar, while in others he personally infiltrated the local priesthood and exposed their corruption. Others yet fell to strength of arms. The temples cast down in flames with their dark adepts trapped inside. With every city of Kolkis that was freed from the Covenant, Lorgar's army grew, as more and more men and women saw the lies of their priestly caste for what they truly were. Of course, the priests of the Covenant reacted to Lorgar's progress. They roused hordes of fanatics and used their ancient sorceries to bring forth horrors from beyond the veil of reality. Though these summons were only of weak rates, they were still abominations from the warp, and the mortals fighting under Lorgar's banner almost broke the first time they were unleashed upon them. But the young Primarch fought against the spectral invocations, and with a burst of golden psychic light, he cast them down back into the tides of the Aether. This would be the first time Lorgar consciously used his immense psychic potential, as well as the events that would make his people grant him the title of Aurelian, which means Golden One in Colchisian. The wars of the false prophets were long and exceedingly cruel. As the tides turned against them, the lords of the covenants grew increasingly desperate and unleashed greater and greater horrors against their own people, as well as Lorgars, in an attempt to maintain their power. Eventually, however, Lorgar and his armies reached Vahardesh, the seat of the Covenant's power. No god worthy of worship would demand such horror be committed in its name. Attributed to Lorgar Aurelian upon witnessing the sacrificial pits of Vahardesh. Once, Vahardesh had been the greatest city of Colchis. Now, as Lorgar's army breached its walls and poured into its streets, it was revealed as a slaughterhouse. Nearly the entire population had been sacrificed over the course of the war to fuel the sorceries of the Covenant priests, or when they had attempted their own rebellions and had been crushed mercilessly. Monsters stalked the ruins, while in the center of the city stood the Spire Temple, where the last priest and their followers remained. The Battle of the Spire Temple was the most violent of the entire war. Demon hosts and other infernal creatures fought against the forces of Lorgar, killing his soldiers until he alone remained standing in the warp-twisted temple. Of the 5,000 men and women Lorgar had taken with him into the Spire Temple, veterans of hundreds of battles, all, while the rest of the army stood watch outside, none returned. Finally, covered in the blood of comrade and foe alike, Lorgar confronted the head priest of the Covenant themselves, led by an old man called Cor Ferron, the most bitter, corrupt, and cruel priest to have ever graced the ranks of the tainted faith. "No more," said the golden giant as he marched above the shattered remnants of yet more monstrosities the old men cowering before his wrath had unleashed against him. This one had been created from the flesh of a child, taken from the streets of Vahardesh, torn from his mother's arms. He had seen it in his mind's eye, and that knowledge had ripped a hole in his heart even as he put the wretched thing out of its misery. "No more," he repeated as he continued to advance. His weapon was gone, broken in combat what seemed to be hours ago. Blood flowed from 100 wounds that refused to close, the scars of which would remain with him until his dying day. He was more than flesh and blood in that moment. He was a vision, a promise of retribution incarnate. The priest knew this, and were rightfully terrified of what was coming for them. Except for one, who spat in the face of this avatar of righteous justice. "You cannot defeat the primordial annihilator, freak. The Covenant is what makes Colchis alive. We are the masters of this world by the will of the gods." The golden giant recognized the old man. He had faced him several times in the past, but always with an army behind him which the coward could hide. Never had he taken to the field in person, even as he drove hundreds of thousands of younger, more deserving life of people to their deaths. "Cor Ferron," Lorgar snarled, something like hatred tainting his voice for the first time in his life. You of all of them, I will enjoy to watch die." The face of the high priest contorted into a hateful grimace, and the wave of sorcerous power left his fingertips, smashing into Lorgar with all the strength the old, rotten man could gather. But the tide of darkness was cast back as the skin of Lorgar began to shine, the inner fire of his soul manifesting in the mortal realm for the first time. Cor Ferron looked on, horrified, as Lorgar continued his advance, his psychic powers finally unleashed. "And in time," continued the golden giant, "I will see your false gods die too, vanish from memory, and be feared no more. Do you hear me, old man? No more." It was barely one Colchisian year, 5 Terran Standard years, after the death of the self-proclaimed Master of the Faith that the Imperium made contact with Colchis once more, leading to the detachment of the Great Crusade were the Emperor and Magnus themselves. The Crimson King had sensed the presence of Lorgar, as well as the battles he had waged against the corrupt clergy of his homeworld. Magnus had demanded that he and his father go to Colchis as quickly as possible, fearing for the safety of his brother. When they arrived, however, the war had already ended, though the price Colchis had paid was terrible indeed. Zahariel, and the Spire Temple had been, at Lorgar's orders, burned to the ground, and the scorched earth salted and declared accursed ground for all of eternity, in order to prevent the corruption of the Covenant from ever returning. Many cities had been destroyed in the war, and the reconstruction was barely beginning to show its effects, even with the mind of a Primarch directing its efforts. Although first contact with Colchis was peaceful, and the reunion between Lorgar and the Emperor went perfectly well, these first days were full of uncertainty. The marks of the warp corruption remained on the planet, and there were those among the Emperor's retinue who argued that the entire world was tainted and had to be purged by fire. The only reason these voices did not also accuse Lorgar of corruption was because he had fought against his representatives, and because he carried the blood of the Master of Mankind. And such accusations were still unthinkable under the Imperial truth. Lorgar, however, knew better than anyone that his beloved homeworld was far from healed from the damage the Covenant had inflicted upon it. The Primarch was also wrecked by guilt, as treacherous parts of him whispered that if he hadn't roused the people of Colchis to rebellion, then the priests wouldn't have had a reason to escalate things to the level they had. The greater, more logical part of him knew that such wasn't the case, that the Covenant alone was responsible for the atrocities it had unleashed. Still, Lorgar was determined to see Colchis reborn, and believed that in order for that rebirth to be complete, it had to be achieved with only minimum interference from the Imperium, of which the world was now part of. He asked his father to let Colchis be under his rule and that of his allies, that the people of the world might rebuild their home themselves. He promised that he would lead the armies of the Emperor in his name, that he would spread the Imperial truth across the galaxy, and do so gladly. All he asked was that he be given the chance to repair the damage wrought upon Colchis. The Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, saw that Lorgar needed to know he could repair and heal as well as conquer and destroy, and granted his son his wish. Then, Lorgar departed Colchis, promising to return in order to learn what he would need to know to fulfill his oath to his father, and to meet the sons he had never known he had. The Great Crusade, harbingers of the Imperial truth. Too long has mankind suffered in the grasp of ignorance and zealotry. Too long have our people been enslaved to lies written by men who were either insane enough to believe them or selfish enough to not care about the damage they caused. Some might claim that these lies gave comfort to mankind, that only through the belief in a higher power can the base nature of man be held in check. And perhaps that was true once, but no more. Now we know the truth of the universe. We have unlocked its secrets, mastered the powers that held it together. We marched among the stars and dreams of building an empire eternal. This, the greatest of endeavor in the history of our species, cannot be achieved if we hold ourselves back with superstition and willful ignorance. We must face the truth of the galaxy and spread the light of illumination across the darkness of the past. The Imperial truth is not a religion. It does not demand blind obedience. It demands conviction. It demands that we trust in one another and in the righteousness of our cause. It demands we believe in ideals, not in idols. My father knows this, and we shall bring this truth to every man, every human in the galaxy. It will not be an easy task. Many will resist the changes. We will bring them, clinging to the past like scared children to a blanket. Some will have to be forced into this new age, and we will do so. We will bear the burden of these wars, for it is what we were made to do. We are the bearers of the word, and the lies of the past shall crumble to ash and dust before us. Extract from the speech of Lorgar Aurelian upon taking command of the 17th Legion. Looking at the history of Lorgar and the Legion he would rise to command, the parallels are striking. During his creation by the Emperor, the 17th Legion was forged as an instrument of destruction against the religious cults that would oppose the imperial truth to the bitter end, fanaticism granting their forces resolve even in the face of overwhelming might. Recruited from the children of defeated foes, the warriors of the 17th were named the Imperial Heralds by the Emperor himself at their founding instead of receiving a name later during the Great Crusade. The first battles were on the surface of Terra herself at the end of the Unification Wars. They were deployed against the last religious redoubts of the planet, and while a few of those surrendered when they saw the ranks of grey-armored transhuman warriors advance towards the walls, those who did not were reduced to little more than rubble and weeping survivors. Such was the dedication of the Imperial Heralds to the Imperium's ideals that they sought out every trace of the superstition their foes had previously embraced and destroyed it. Libraries were examined book by book in order to identify those who glorified sorcery, false gods, and irrational beliefs. Temples were raised, often with their priests still inside, and monuments toppled with explosives. These people were given the choice to either accept the imperial truth or be destroyed alongside the shackles of their past. While the Imperial Heralds were only sent against the worst fanatical holdouts of Terra, places where human sacrifices and witch kings were common, the extremes to which they were ready to go unsettled many of the Emperor's allies. But so did most of the other newly founded Space Marine legions, and so had the Thunder Warriors before them. The Emperor, in his wisdom, knew that he couldn't unite mankind under his rule and save it from the darkness of its past without warriors such as these amongst his servants. And so it was that under the leadership of High Herald Heilig Gar, the 17th Legion took to the stars alongside the rest of the Great Crusade's forces. Several decades later, when Lorgar took command of the 17th Legion, he renamed them from the Imperial Heralds the Word Bearers, although their colors remained unchanged, gray with silver linings. For his inspired words, the Legion soon bestowed the name of Urizen upon their Primarch. In ancient Terran legends, the Urizen was a being of great wisdom, representing conventional reason and law. A fitting title for Lorgar. Lorgar knew that without a cause worthy of fighting for, even the greatest soldier was doomed to become a rabid dog or an empty shell. But he also feared that blindly following the imperial truth would make his sons little different than the zealots they fought. So he reached out to his brother Magnus the Red and asked for his help in making his sons philosophers as well as warriors. Under Lorgar's leadership, the grim and dour 17th Legion became a heaven of learning and illumination, whose warriors followed the imperial truth not because they had been told to do so, but because they truly understood it and what it brought to mankind. Every Primarch inherited an aspect of the Emperor. Horus inherited his drive for conquest, Magnus his psychic might, Mortarion his grim determination to do what had to be done, and Lorgar his conviction and ideals. As such, no other Primarch was as enthusiastic as Lorgar was to join the efforts of the Great Crusade. His belief in the imperial truth eclipsed even that of the likes of Horus or Conrad, though both of them would come to worry about where the strength of his conviction might lead him. That conviction made Lorgar one of the figureheads of the Crusade, looked upon by the human elements of the Imperium, while the fury with which he prosecuted his war made him a figure of respectful fear. The deep belief he had in the imperial truth gave him prestige and authority in the Imperium. Many imperial regiments were willing to go fight in the expeditionary fleets under the command of a 17th Legion officer, and when the worlds peacefully joined the Imperium after contact with one of their fleet, it was a rare case indeed when there wasn't a substantial army gifted to the fleet to help bring illumination to other worlds. Lorgar was also one of the few Primarchs who, alongside Magnus and Mortarion, was aware of the true dangers of the warp, dangers that the Emperor had decided best mankind remain unaware. His campaign on Colchis had shown him the true horrors that dwelled within the Immaterium, though he still lacked any knowledge of the ruinous powers themselves. At first, Lorgar wanted to reveal all that he knew to the rest of mankind, that they be better prepared to defend against it. But the Emperor commanded him to wait, for he had grand plans that would be ruined by acting too soon. Lorgar chose to trust his father, but still made sure that his own chaplains were kept aware of the truth. Because he had fought against the Covenant's leaders with his own psychic powers, Lorgar strived to create a powerful librarius within his own legion. He had a great deal of respect for Magnus, who helped him master his previously erratic psychic powers by teaching him the discipline of the Thousand Suns, and whose own Magus helped the first Word-bearer librarians master their own abilities. During the Great Crusade, Lorgar's reputation among his brothers was divided. To some, like Horus or Magnus, he was an upstanding champion of the Imperial truth. But to others, like Russ and Lionel Johnson, his relentless extermination of all things related to religion was going too far. Russ and Lorgar famously had a terrible dispute when they first met, with Lorgar calling the Wolf King a fool because of the amulets and trinkets his warriors bore into battle, and the ridiculous belief of his psychers, whom Russ refused to even acknowledge as such, clinging to Pharisaian folly to their powers were granted by their homeworld. Erebus. I hate this guy. Warden of the Truth. In a legion known for its fiery temperament, Erebus was one of the few cool heads capable of advising caution and prudence when they were required. Born on Colchis during the Wars of the False Priest, he was among the first selected from the world to become an Astartes. Not only did he take the implants well, he also displayed an acute mind and a strong will, which marked him for induction into the ranks of the chaplains. Within a few decades, Erebus had risen to become the first chaplain of the 17th Legion, and one of Lorgar's own advisors. So valued was his counsel that even other Primarchs such as Horus and Perturabos sought it out. Erebus was known to speak out even when he knew that what he had to say would not please his commander, even when he knew it would enrage him. For this, Lorgar himself gave him the title of Warden of the Truth, asking his son to swear always to speak the truth and never say a single lie. Erebus took the vow with great pride, and as far as our records show, he didn't break it until the day of his death. On the primitive world of Davin, it was Erebus who led the Word-bearers contingent. The chaplain recognized the tribal markings of the Davanites' tribes, having seen them on the walls of the Covenant's temples during the Wars of the False Priests. He warned Horus of the dangers they represented, and though he knew that it went against the heart of the Primarch, he advised that the entire tribes be wiped out to root out the warp's corruption. Horus listened to his advice, and it was the Word-bearers who purged the tribes and erased every trace of their culture. It is said that the Davanite campaign marked the first occasion where the now legendary trace-like state of the 17th Legion's warriors was witnessed by outsiders, and it unnerved even the brave sons of Lupercal. But the one brother with whom Lorgar had the most open feud, a feud that almost erupted into outright warfare, was Robout Guilliman. At first glance, it seems that the two of them should have gotten along perfectly well, for they were both champions of the Imperial truth, spreading illumination across the galaxy. And indeed, such was the case in their first meeting, to the point that the two of them chose to join forces for a time, and fight side by side so that their warriors could deepen their bonds of brotherhood and learn from each other. Guilliman thought his men could learn from the Word-bearer's passion, while Lorgar was sure that his legion could benefit from the orderly fashion in which the Ultramarines waged war. In the beginning, this collaboration went incredibly well, and several worlds were added to the Imperium in record time, some by force and some by diplomacy. Then the two legions came to the world of Kur, and everything began to unravel. Kur was a planet whose technological level had regressed to the point where it was all its people could do to maintain a few artificial satellites in orbit. Its population was divided into powerful city-states. These pocket kingdoms had been fighting a terrible civil war for the last 100 years, started by the rising of a new religion in some of the cities. This religion had quickly spread to over half the city-states, and eventually they had declared holy war against those who had not yet accepted the new faith. By the time the Imperium reached Kur, only one city, Monarchia, was holding out against the religion. When contact was made with the local government, the dominant faction, ruled over by a circle of kings with priestly advisors from the new faith, were more than willing to join the Imperium. Guilliman was delighted and proposed his services to negotiate peace between them and the people of Monarchia, or even evacuation to another planet if the city's denizens could not be convinced. But Lorgar reacted much differently. The moment that Urizen saw the symbols on the priest's robes, the second he heard the first words of their prayers, he knew them for what they were. Descendants of those members of the Covenant he had failed to destroy. Many had fled Colchis when the Imperium had come to Lorgar's homeworld. It appeared that some of them had found Kur before the Imperium, and seeded it with the lies of their corrupt faith. Lorgar's mind flashed back to the wars of the false priests, to all the atrocities he had seen committed by the Covenant in the name of defending its power. There was only one course of action possible. When Guilliman discussed with the leaders of the religious coalition aboard his flagship, Lorgar gave the order to all of his troops to begin the attack. Drop pods rained over the cities of Kur, with only Monarchia being spared. Led by their chaplains, the word-bearers sought and destroyed every religious edifice and slew every priest, while the Imperium True was broadcast on all channels. Lorgar would take no chances this time. He had the resources to truly purge Kur from the taint, and he did not hesitate to use them. When the avenging son heard of what his brother had done, his rage was immense. But it paled before his shock. He called to Lorgar, desperately asking what could possibly have motivated his brother to perform such an attack while under the flag of truce. Had the people of Kur deceived him somehow? Had they been planning an attack? And if so, why had Lorgar not warned him? But his queries went unanswered. Lorgar knew that he was not allowed to tell Guilliman of what he had seen on Colchis. The Emperor had forbidden it. It was hardly the first time a legion had attacked the planet seemingly unprovoked. The Salamanders were beginning to develop a dread reputation for such assaults. Though it tore his heart, Lorgar believed that it was better for his brother to think him a butcher than to learn of the truth that dwelled in the warp. Without responding to any more communication from the Ultramarines, the word-bearers continued their campaign of purification. It took them only a week to be done, and by that point, Guilliman was almost ready to order his fleet to open fire if Lorgar would not answer his calls. But just as he shouted this ultimatum over the Vox, the ships of the 17th Legion recovered their transports and departed the system, still not answering Guilliman's pleas for answer. There are things you are better off not knowing, brother. Last transmission from the Fidelis Lex before leaving the cursed system. The 31 millennium. Still, one cannot help but wonder how different history would have been had Lorgar broken his vow of silence and told Guilliman why he had needed to attack her in such a merciless manner. There are even some among the Imperium today who blame Aurelian for the eventual descent of Guilliman into treachery, arguing that if Lorgar had not reacted so violently to the presence of the Covenant on Kur, then the planet could have been purged of its influence slowly and more subtly, in a way that would not have antagonized Guilliman and caused him to lose more faith in the Imperium when Lorgar went unpunished after the events, despite Guilliman's appeal for his censure. Soon after the unpleasantness of Kur, the convocation came for all available Primarchs to journey to Ulanor to celebrate the great triumph over the alien empire of the Orcs. While Lorgar was as surprised as his brothers when he learned that the Emperor intended to leave the leadership of the Great Crusade and return to Terra, He was also relieved that such would be the case. In the prior years, the Urizen had noticed a worrying pattern in the Imperium, a growing cult that worshipped the Emperor as a god, despite all his insistence to the contrary. It was Lorgar's hope that with Horus now in charge of the Great Crusade, the flames of this misguided devotion would fade, as it was proven that someone other than the Master of Mankind could direct the Imperium. Because of this, Lorgar was one of the most fervent supporters of Horus as the new War Master of the Imperium. He readily obeyed the commands of his brother and spread his legion on the vast fronts of the Great Crusade to support it. At the time, the Word-Bearers were one of the most numerous legions, thanks to the high compatibility rate of Lorgar's gene seed and the abundance of aspirants from Kolkith's booming population. It is estimated that at the time of the Ulnor triumph, there was as many as 120,000 Astartes in the 17th Legion, though such a count is by nature imprecise. To Lorgar, the outcome of the Council of Nicaea was never in doubt. He knew the horrors that dwelled in the warp, and he knew that his father knew. How could the Emperor possibly deny his forces the tools they needed to oppose such a threat? The mere thought of it was laughable. Lorgar didn't attend the council in person, but he did ensure that Erebus was present to speak on his behalf. And the first chaplain's fiery oratory helped persuade many of the other present that the Emperor's ultimate decision was the correct one. Erebus returned to his Primarch's side with the satisfaction of a task well performed, content to have played his part in helping preserve the Imperium's future. Then, a few years later, while the galaxy was enveloped by ever more potent warp storms, a message came from Terra, and the Word-Bearers learned that the future of the Imperium had been destroyed forever. The Heresy, lost amidst the madness. If they do not kneel, then every single one of the 500 worlds will burn. Attributed to Lorgar Aurelian upon the declaration of the Retribution Crusade to Ultramar. When word of Guliman's treachery at Ishvan 3 reached Lorgar, the rage of the Primarch was terrible to behold. What few records speak of this fury mention that it was lucky that the Urizen was on a planet at the time, for the psychic power he unleashed would have damaged the ship beyond repair. Had the message not also carried Horus' instruction for Lorgar and his legion, it is doubtless that the Primarch would have taken the full might of the 17th with him to Ishvan, determined to kill Guliman in his bare hands if he had to. How different things would have unfolded had that been the case, we will never know, for Horus had other plans for the Word-Bearers. 7 legions were already en route to Ishvan with the task of bringing the traitors to heel. But there was another concern that needed to be addressed. Ultramar, one of the mightiest and richest regions of the Imperium, had been revealed as being under the leadership of a traitor for 200 years. Knowing Guliman's strategic acumen, it was very likely that the entire kingdom of Ultramar had been transformed into a fortress, one that could supply the traitors with weapons, armor, and recruits for decades. While the legions dispatched at Ishvan should be enough to destroy those which had broken their oaths to the Imperium, Ultramar needed to be brought to heel. To that end, the War Master commanded Lorgar to take his forces to meet with the 12th Legion, the World Eaters, led by their Primarch Angron. Together, the two of them were to ensure the continued compliance of Ultramar to Imperial rule by whatever means necessary. Horus's orders were still deliberately kept vague, so that his brothers would be able to react to the situation and adapt as to whatever threats they encountered. But even he couldn't predict what the two legions would face. The meeting of Lorgar and Angron was agitated, but eventually the two of them agreed to journey to Khalt first, where the Lord of the Red Sands believed they would find the greatest military target in the 500 worlds. It was Angron's hope that he and Lorgar could convince whoever Guliman had left in command to abandon this mad rebellion. This might seem overly optimistic, but Angron was yet unaware of the true nature of the foe the Loyalists faced. Lorgar had attempted to explain it to him, But hearing about the horror of chaos isn't enough. You have to see it for yourself to truly know why it must be fought and eradicated. Still, Lorgar agreed to the plan, thinking that if they crushed the core of Guilliman's military might in the 500 worlds, the rest of the campaign would be much easier. However, both Angron and Lorgar were proven wrong when at Kalt, the Ruin Storm was unleashed, trapping the two legions out of the rest of the Galactic War. But all too aware of what had transpired on the unhallowed sands of Ishvan V. The Battle of Kalt was terrible, and the cost of lives of thousands of legionnaires. Cost the lives of thousands of legionnaires. But in the end, they were able to escape the thrice-damned planet and begin their journey back to the Imperium. An odyssey that would in time be known as the Shadow Crusade. Lorgar used his psychic powers to mentally link with every navigator, astropath, and librarian in the fleet, and together they guided the fleet through the roiling seas of the Immaterium, keeping the vessels anchored to one another, though many were still lost to the raging Ruin Storm. The fate of their crews best not dwelled upon. Argyll Tal, the Crimson Lord. Born of Colchis, Argyll Tal was selected to become a word-bearer by the first chaplain Erebus himself. His chapter, the Serrated Sun, took considerable losses during the Battle of Kalt. Its entire command structure was decimated, which forced Argyll Tal, as the sole surviving captain, to take command of the few hundred warriors who remained. As the battle outside the Ultramarines' fortress went on, with the demonic tides clashing against loyalist lines, and the Primarch still trapped inside, it fell to Argyll Tal and Karn, the 8th captain of the World Eaters, to direct their legions. The two of them fought back to back against the infernal hordes until Lorgar and Angron burst free from the fortress and helped beat back the hordes long enough for an evacuation to take place. By that point, however, Argyll Tal had fought for so long and seen so many of his brothers die that his armor was covered in their blood, and he was completely lost to the cold rage of the Word-Bearer's gene line. Only the intervention of Lorgar dragged him back to sanity and convinced him to evacuate with the rest of the legions, rather than remain behind to fight the demons until he died. To honor the sacrifice of his brothers, Argyll Tal repainted his armor in red, so that their blood would never truly be washed away. This led him to receiving the title of Crimson Lord, and his deeds during the Shadow Crusade are the stuff of legends. He and Karn developed a deep bond of brotherhood and fought together against the demon Egetel, casting down her serpentine form while resisting her lies. In time, Argyll Tal rose from being a mere captain in a minor chapter to becoming a lord of the Legion, whose word was heeded by Lorgar and Angron themselves. Together, he and Karn helped maintain the desperate alliance between the World Eaters and Word Bearers. It is said that the two of them fought in the World Eaters' fighting pits, chained to one another, and took on any challenge. They rarely won, but according to the accounts that have survived... Wait, what? They rarely won? But according to the accounts that have survived, it was only because neither of them took these brawls seriously. On the battlefield, Argyll Tal was every bite as deadly as Karn or any other Legion champion. Also, they were just playing. Argyll Tal survived 300 years past the end of the Roboutian Heresy, before falling during battle against the Dark Angel's warband. The details of his death are unclear, and there are even some accounts that he didn't die, but vanished in the fashion of his Primarch, and might one day return. After escaping Kalt, the fleet was soon drawn to the world of Wait a minute. I'm thinking of Ardamantua from The Beast Arises. To the world of Armatua, the tides of the warp conspiring to push the vessels to the system. Once, the planet had been a recruiting ground for the Ultramarines, where 1 billion soldiers had been garrisoned and entire generations of legionnaires had been raised. Now, it was an infernal pit, ruled over by an entity Lorgar was all too familiar with. Corferon, the master of the Covenant's fate, whom he had slain 200 years ago on Colchis. Somehow, the spirit of the old cruel man had been spared disillusion in the Sea of Souls, and returned to some abhorrent half-life by the ruinous powers to destroy the one who had defeated him in life. The ghost of an old man stood upon the bridge of the Emperor's hand, staring at Erebus with the burning gaze. The first chaplain knew that face. He had seen it painted on the holy books of his youth, in a city that had been at war with Lorgar's revolt against the Covenant. This was the face of Corferon, the Master of Fate, supreme leader of the Covenant, who had been slain by Rorgar some 200 years ago. Lorgar should have been ours, said the apparition, but he denied us. The gods will not forgive him his defiance. But you, my brother, you can still be redeemed. Join us. Embrace the powers of the primordial truth, and you will never need to kneel before anyone again. Images filled Erebus's mind of all that he could accomplish if he but accepted the spectre's offer. He saw himself standing before rows upon rows of kneeling figures, statues in his image raised on 1,000 worlds, billions of throats chanting his name. He saw the word-bearers reborn as agents of the primordial truth, setting worlds aflame and beings covered in gifts in return for their devotion. He saw himself wielding power greater than even that of Lorgar, shaping worlds with but a thought, twisting destiny to his will with a sweep of the hand. All this and more could be his. All he had to do was to order his ship to open fire on the Fideliatus Lex. The shields of the venerable vessel were down, brought low by the volleys of Armatuar's planetary defense. Just one order. Then he remembered something. Something he had seen as a child. One of his very first memories. He remembered seeing his siblings crucified by the Covenant's priests as a sacrifice to the Pantheon, to gain victory against the forces of Lorgar. No, he whispered. Then he shouted, "No, I will never be the Dark God's pawn, and this legion shall not be their slave." Erebus ordered that his ship, the Emperor's Hand, set a collision course with Armantua's surface, right in the center of the psychic entanglement that trapped the World-Bearers and World-Eaters in the system. The ship detonated, shattering the surface of the planet and causing it to break apart, and several smaller fragments still orbiting around the diseased star to this day, each the domain of a dark mechanicum arch-heretic. With the heroic sacrifice of Erebus, Argyolthal rose to become Lorgar's second-in-command of the 17th Legion, and the Shadow Crusade continued. The destruction of Corferon's demonic aspect broke the spell that held the combined fleet captive in Armatua, and the ships departed, though their journey did not last long until they were stopped once more. And this time, the Demon Lord anchoring them was much more powerful. Angron was dying. His brother was lying down before him, losing blood from a dozen wounds, each of which would kill him given time. If the distance, the great beast that had so wounded his brother was roaring its hatred of the universe, while dozens of World-Eaters Terminators were fighting against it, holding it into place so that it could not reach the Primarch. More of the Devourers were dying with each passing second, but they would not give up. They would not break. They could not break. Tears flowed down Lorgar's face at the sight of such courage, such devotion. He placed his hand upon his brother's torn chest and called upon the power that had been bestowed upon him by the Emperor. Golden light poured from his hands, and the wounds of Angron began to close. The breathing of the Lord of the Red Sands becoming more regular. With his brother's life stabilized, Lorgar looked at the great beast again and knew what must be done. He opened a Vox channel, raising the Fidelitas Flex in orbit, and gave a simple order. Fire. Seconds later, a column of fire descended from the heavens as the Glorian Gloriana class warship opened fire on the location transmitted by the Devourer's beacons, accompanied by the rest of the fleet. The earth of the accursed world cracked under such power, and Doombred, the antediluvian prince of the dark god Khorne, was banished from the mortal universe once more, taking with him the lives of 300 of the noblest human warriors who had ever lived. This pattern of journeying ever closer to the edge of the ruin storm, while true salvation remained out of reach, continued for years. Time inside the storm had meaning, and some survivors claimed that to them the entire ordeal had lasted mere months, while others had trouble remembering anything before it. Always the fleet would emerge from some tumultuous tides into a more peaceful enclave, and always they would need to slay the local demonic overlord in order to be able to leave once more. The names of the slain demons adorned the records of the 17th Legion: Samus, Doombreed, Skarbrand, Zrakinil, Atos Raul Keres, that was a hard one, and a dozen others. The Word Bearers and the World Eaters both earned the eternal enmity of many lords of the warp during the Shadow Crusade, while also gaining an expertise in fighting them that has transcended generations. We do not know for certain how the two legions finally escaped the ruin storm. The truth of the Shadow Crusade has long since faded into legends, especially since most of those who survived it repressed their memories of it to avoid descending into madness. Ancient fragmentary texts refer to a device that was cast into the shadow of the warp by the plot of foolish, selfish men, and of a great sacrifice unlike any other in the galaxy, yet only the herald of another greater one. Barbaras, Lorgar vociferated over the vox. Do not do this. I have to, my lord, replied the voice of the old warsmith. He sounded so tired. Ever since the fleet had found him on Armartua, Barbatas Dantiok's body had been growing weaker, even as his mind grew sharper and sharper. I have to. Terra needs you and your brothers. The Imperium needs you. Your father needs you. There has to be another way, pleaded the Golden Primarch. Please, Barbaras, you have given so much to the Imperium already. There must be another way. Maybe. But what will every second spent searching for it cost? No, my lord. This must be done. Please tell my father that in the end, I died with dignity. Deep within the twisted remnants of Dark Glass Station, a lever was pushed, and an old man sat upon a throne of torment and ruin. Lorgar roared in sorrow and pain as the warp around the fleet flared with light. Even over the unimaginable distance of space, he sensed Dantiok's agony as the device consumed him entirely. Then, the madness of the ruin storm was gone from the oculus, replaced by the blackness of space, with the distant lights of stars. But regardless of the significance of these words, the combined fleet of the World Bearers and World Eaters did emerge from the ruin storm. For all the sacrifices they had paid to escape, the war raged still, and they were still determined to play a part in it. The traumatized crews of the battered ships set to work to repair what was needed. The navigators set course through the tumultuous warp, and the fleet began its way back home, to the throne world, where the fate of mankind would be decided. Yet despite all their efforts, the 12th and 17th Legion arrived too late. The imminent arrival had forced Guilliman to a final, desperate gambit that had ultimately cost the arch-traitor his life, but had also taken the mortal existence of the Emperor away. Lorgar marched through the ruins of Terra and into the Imperial Palace, and fell to his knees before the enthroned figure of the Emperor. Despite the stasis field and the power of the Golden Throne, Lorgar knew that, for a second time in his life, he had lost his father. Post-heresy, Keepers of the Flame. We are still here, though our empire is broken. Though the oaths of our brothers lie in ruin at our feet, we are still here. Though unspeakable horrors were unleashed upon us, Though reason and order have departed the universe and left only cruelty and madness in their wake, we are still here. We are not defeated. We are not broken. And we remain untainted. Even now, as the ink of the words dry on this page, the degradation of the Imperium continues. The ideals of the Great Crusade are forgotten, or cast aside in a desperate need to find a way to make sense of the galaxy once again. Human minds are too weak to bear the weight of the horrors we now know to be true. If only we had had more time. 1 generation, 2 at most, born and educated as my father intended, imbued with the power of the imperial truth. But that will never be now. It is too late. Too late. But we are still here. From the writings of Lorgar Aurelian, post-heresy. After the end of the siege and the banishment of the traitor legions to the Eye of Storm and the Ruin Storm, a dark mood fell upon Lorgar. Everything he had fought to build was slipping away as the Imperium slowly turned away from the imperial truth. His sons watched, helpless as their father descended further and further into melancholy, until news reached them that a host of demons had broken through the iron cage surrounding the Ruin Storm and were wreaking havoc on the world of the Ultima Segmentum. As soon as he heard the astropathic calls for aid, Lorgard appeared to be revived, fire returning to his eyes. He called the full might of his legion to him, and went to meet this demonic horde, determined to cast back the horrors of the warp to the hell that had spawned them. 4 terrible greater demons led this demonic incursion, one for each of the Chaos Gods. A display of unity unseen since the days of the heresy, and that portended dark times for the Imperium if they were not stopped. It was on the world of Kur, again, where Lorgar and Guilliman had first turned against one another all these years ago, that the World Bearers brought the infernal legions to battle. So numerous were the demons that they blackened the skies, but still the World Bearers attacked. In the confusion of battle, Lorgar became separate from his sons, and it was all they could do to watch. Helpless to intervene, as the 4 greater demons revealed themselves around the Primarch. Then the tides of the battle obscured the Urizen from sight, and when the next legionnaires could see where he and the infernal princelings had stood, they found nothing but scorched earth. Lorgar Aurelian was gone, as were the 4 great demons. Without its leaders, the demonic horde soon turned against itself, and the threat to the Imperium was stopped. At the cost of one of its few remaining princes. 4 they were, terrible and powerful, beyond the ken of mortal men. Each was a lord amongst its kin, a fragment of the dreaded god it served. In most circumstances, they would have turned against one another in a heartbeat. But here and now, they were united in their hatred of the one who had dared to defy their masters. "You have failed, Golden One," croaked the bird-head Lord of Change. "Your father had fallen, son of Colchis," burped a bloated Great Unclean One. "His pain feeds us," hissed the Keeper of Secrets, trembling with delight at the wounds it had inflicted and suffered alike. "His blood," grunted the colossal bloodthirster, "and that of his little empire will flow for 10,000 years." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of battle being waged between the world bearers and the infernal legions that had come to this world. Then there was a soft chuckle. "I know you," declared the demigod whose demonic lords had brought to his knees. "I know you all. I know what you are. Demons. Fallen. Tengu. In the end, there is only one name that truly defines you. Liars." Lorgar Aurelian, son of the Emperor of Mankind, rose to his feet. Illuminarium held firmly in his hands, and stared defiantly at the abominations before him. "I name you deceivers and falsehoods," continued the Primarch, his voice gaining in strength with every word. "Broken promises and empty shells. You have no power over me." Something in his gaze, in his words, made the demons scream in fury, and the champions of the eternal war between the order and chaos changed. And the champions of the eternal war between order and chaos charged at him. After the disappearance of Lorgar, Chapter Master Argyotal rose to the rank of Legion Master and led the Wardbearers for a further 300 years before his own death. A new Legion Master was chosen, and the 17th Legion continued its long war against the many elements of mankind. By choice, they remained far from the Imperial centers of power, if at all possible, trying to avoid stirring up internal conflict between the Legion and the rest of the Imperium. Then, in the early 36th millennium, came the Age of Apostasy, a period of turmoil and conflict that almost destroyed the Imperium. Several Black Crusades erupted from the Eye of Terror and the Ruin Storm, throwing the Immaterium out of balance. The resulting warp storms engulfed entire sectors, leaving their inhabitants at the non-existent mercy of the demonic incursions that ravaged their worlds. Taking advantage of the confusion, Orc war bosses led their war across the galaxy, while the Dark Eldars left their shadowy realms in unprecedented numbers to prey upon the people of the Imperium. Even threats from the Imperium's own distant, all but forgotten past re-emerged, such as Tralhradir, the leader of the infamous Wolf Brothers. The plague of unbelief, his actions triggered near the galactic borders, took most of the 14th and 15th legions to purge. The Space Marine legions were more stretched out than ever, combating these various threats, as were the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, and all other military organizations of the Imperium. It was during that period that on distant Terra rose one of the greatest monsters of the Imperium's long and bloody history, a man whose name would become a curse for thousands of years to come, Godj Vandir. The details of Vandir's rise to power, his rule, and subsequent downfall are unfathomably complex. Here is a simplified version, which is also the only one historians agree upon, without their debates degenerating into academic feuds that even the most seasoned inquisitors are wary of. Vandir was the incarnation of every flaw in the Imperium. Through political intrigue, blackmail, and backstabbing, he had risen to become the master of the Administratum, earning a seat among the 12 High Lords of Terra. His rule over the monolithic organization was already brutal and merciless, to the point that other High Lords began to raise concerns. Before they could act on them, however, Vandir made his move to claim even more power for himself. At the time, the Ecclesiarchy had risen to unprecedented levels of influence, taking advantage of the fear spread across the Imperium by the many threats that had arisen to the Imperium. A terrified population turned to the priests of the God Emperor for salvation, and the cardinals used them for their own political gains, while the armies of the Master of Mankind fought and died against the hordes of the traitors, the aliens, and the heretic. Even as an entire sector set all their resources supporting the war efforts, other regions of the Imperium were crushed by increased tides for the construction of grand temples and extravagant palaces. Before the threat of retribution from the World-Bearers and their allies among the other legions had kept the worst excesses of the Ecclesiarchy's high representatives in check. But now, the Sons of Lorgar were too busy fighting the enemy without to concern themselves with the enemy within. The enemy without. They were too busy fighting the enemy without to concern themselves with the enemy within. And the armies of the Frateris Templar were one of the few military forces remaining inside the Imperium's borders. Vandir played to the other High Lords' fears of the Ecclesiarchy's hubris by waging an open campaign against its influence. Many saw him as a counterforce, the unchecked power of the Ecclesiarch, but even them did not foresee Vandir's true plan. In the 200 years of the 36th millennium, when the incumbent Ecclesiarch died under mysterious circumstances, Some say that Vandir convinced the Grand Master of the Assassins to eliminate the man. His successor, Paulus III, was elected with Vandir's backing. A foolish and decadent man, Paulus III would not have been the worst ecclesiarch to have sit in the chair, but he did not rule for long. Mere days after Paulus III's elevation, Vandir stormed the ecclesiarch's palace on Terra with several regiments worth of imperial guard. He then denounced Paulus as a heretic and summarily executed him by his own hand. He then claimed the title of ecclesiarch for himself, vowing to purge the emperor's church from corruption. The cardinals who opposed him, fearful of his power, fled Terra in a massive fleet, but they were caught in the warp storm mere weeks after departing the Sol system and were never heard of again. Claiming that this was a sign of the emperor favoring him, while in truth it was either a coincidence or moved by the dark gods to weaken the imperium from within, Vandir secured his hold over the ecclesiarchy, replacing the lost cardinals with his own cronies before beginning his true, bloody, terrifying work. Perhaps Vandir was truly motivated by the desire to cleanse the imperium of the ecclesiarchy's undue influence. But if that is so, he lost his way on the path to accomplishing that goal and became a greater threat to the imperium than any since Guliman himself. His rule as both master of the administratum and ecclesiarch is recorded in imperial archives as the reign of blood, and trillions of souls were lost to his madness and atrocities. Vandir began his reign by ordering purges of the ecclesiarchy and declaring several wars of fate, sending billions of the faithful to bolster the ranks of the imperium's defenders on the front lines. Though these hordes were useful for little more than cannon fodder, the gesture made the imperial military commanders more ready to accept his holding of two high lords' offices at once. It also allowed him to send many of his potent enemies to their doom, as they were granted the honor of leading these crusades. While cold-blooded and cynical, such a move was little more than a display of cunning among the High Lords. As what happened after that granted Vandir his place in the Imperium's annals of infamy. Within months of his accession, Vandir went truly mad. Perhaps it was due to all the power he possessed. Perhaps it was because of the pressure of his responsibilities in an Imperium that was still facing multiple crises at once. Perhaps it was a result of some plot of his rivals amongst the High Lords, or a scheme by any of the many enemies of mankind. Despite centuries-long investigations, we still do not know for certain. The possibility that maybe Vandir was just acting like a normal human is, to most inquisitors, too disquieting to contemplate. With most of the imperial forces busy on the front lines, Vandir's Frateris Templar and other military assets could impose their will upon the Imperium unopposed. Entire worlds were purged by flame as Vandir denounced their population as heretics for all manners of sins, from refusing to bow to his will to not paying their tithes fast enough. Over time, even these small justifications were abandoned entirely, and the ships under the tyrant's command did not question their orders as they destroyed entire star systems. On other worlds, horrifying pogroms were committed, based on the slightest genetic differences to what Vandir and his madness considered to be the perfect human form. All the while, on the worlds terrified of being the next on the tyrant's list, great monuments were built, dedicated not to the Emperor, but to Vandir's own glory. These acts of heresy, however, paled compared to how Vandir deceived a religious sect known as the Daughters of the Emperor into becoming his personal bodyguards and servants. By faking a miracle through the use of his stolen ecclesiarch Rosarius, he convinced the all-female, isolated order that he was blessed by the god Emperor, and spoke with his voice. Renamed as the brides of the Emperor, these sister warriors would become one of the most dangerous agents of Vandir's will. They notably purged the Holy Synod when the cardinals attempted to have Vandir deposed, their loose standards and morals finally being breached by Vandir's atrocities. The reign of Vandir lasted for 7 decades, and would doubtlessly have lasted much longer if not for the heroic actions of a few individuals. A group of Inquisitors had secretly come back to Terra from the battlefield, seeking to access the archives of the Ordos on the throne world. On their way, they witnessed the horrors Vandir had unleashed in the name of the Emperor upon his own people. When they arrived to Terra, they were determined to cast down Vandir, but he was too powerful in his domain to be defeated with the means at the Inquisitor's disposal. The polar fortress of the Ordos had been all but empty to support the war effort, and what few stormtroopers and agents remained would never make it through the brides of the Emperor's watchful guard. Instead, the Inquisitors resolved to send an astropathic message, powerful enough to pass through the warp storm clouding the galaxy. After a daring raid on the Astra Telepathica's headquarters to secure the astropaths required, the Psykers and their retinues amplified the transmission power, and the message was sent. Its contents were condensation of all the information they had accumulated on Vandir's many crimes and heresies. Its destination was the edge of the Ruin Storm, where the Word-Bearers were fighting against the Black Crusade led by two of the infamous Ultramarines Tetrax. The message reached the Sons of Lorgar just as they had finally pushed back the tide of traitors and demons. With the help of Ordo Malus Inquisitors and the Brotherhood of the Grey Knights, the Tetrax had been banished, and coordinated strikes had slain the remaining leaders, breaking the Crusade's backbone. The fleet of the 17th Legion was busy, repairing the damage it had endured and recovering its warriors, when the astropathic call breached through the tumult of the warp. Such was its strength that when it finally reached its intended destination, every astropath, psyker, and librarian in the solar system received the full contents of the message at once. We, Inquisitors, like to believe that we know the meaning of righteousness, that by our very calling our souls are imbued with the Emperor's will, guiding our actions. When wrath takes us, as we witness the horrors visited by the enemies of mankind upon their victims, we delude ourselves into thinking that it is righteous, inspired rage. But we are wrong. The human mind is designed so that all rage feels righteous. It is both our gift and our curse, a potent weapon and the source of countless damnations. But the World-Bearers, they know true righteous fury. It is written into their very genetic code, the legacy of their Primarch, and when the message echoed in our minds of this blasted, ruined, nameless world, I saw it. It is impossible to describe what I felt from them, because no human has ever felt such an emotion. There are no words in any of the myriad languages of man to do justice to the cold, blazing fury, the utter certainty of purpose, the obligation, not the desire or need, to travel to Terra and end the life of the madman who had usurped power there. The hatred they had displayed for the heretics and traitors we had fought before paled compared to their reaction to Vandir's atrocities. It was as inspiring to behold as it was terrifying, and on the journey to Terra, I found myself wondering if the Imperium wouldn't be saved from Vandir's clutches, only to be destroyed by the righteous judgment of the Sons of Lorgar. Excerpt from Fighting Alongside the Sons of Lorgar, Loyalty Over Fate, by Inquisitor Jaeger. Aaron Jaeger. It doesn't say that, but I just made it. Once the shock had passed, the World-Bearers prepared to return to Terra, determined to bring Vandir to justice, regardless of who or what stood in their way. They did not attempt to hide their wrathful coming, instead sending astropathic message before them in the warp, demanding that Vandir surrender his power and await the judgment of the Emperor's angels of death. I was about to say Emperor's children. Enraged, Vandir denounced the Word-Bearers as heretics, finally revealed as being no better than the traitors they had claimed to fight. In his madness, the High Lord convinced himself that the Sons of Lorgar had actually always been in collusion with the forces of chaos, and plotting against the ecclesiarchy to weaken the Imperium from within. That Vandir himself had once opposed the power of the Imperium cult was something he had forgotten by that point. The Word Bearers were opposing him. Therefore, the Word Bearers were heretics. Sound logic. Vandir gathered almost all the forces at his disposal in an immense fleet under the command of his most trustworthy lieutenants, and sent it to meet and destroy the armada of the 17th Legion. Hundreds of ships of all classes were massed in this fleet, though the quality of its commanders was sorely lacking, as all the experienced officers of the Imperial Navy had been sent to the front lines long ago. Still, it was a force to be reckoned with, and should it have met the World Bearers, the resulting void engagement would have been both epic in scale and devastating to any victor who had emerged. But the fleet never reached the World Bearers. Soon after they left the Sol system, the ships sent by Vandir were caught in an incredibly violent and localized warp storm that removed them from the galaxy entirely. To this day, the storm rages still and is known in Imperial maps as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath. Indeed, it is believed that the storm was sent by the Emperor himself from the Golden Throne as punishment to those who had desecrated his empire and as aid to his true agents. Unaware of the fleet's fate, unaware they had been, sent against them, the Word Bearers continued their journey to Terra. But they were not the only ones to finally move against the mad tyrant. Long before the Inquisitors returned to Terra and discovered what had become of the core Imperium in their absence, another power opposing the bloody rule of Vandir had risen in the Segmentum Obscurus, on the world of Diamamar, A young priest named Sebastian Thor had publicly denounced the Ecclesiarch as a traitor and a heretic, and though the sheer strength of his conviction and charisma, the entire planet has soon followed him into his defiance of Vandir. Even the governor had bent the knee before the young man and placed the entire military force of whatever this planet's name is under his command. Thor left Diamamar and began to make his own journey towards Terra, stopping at the very human world he passed to preach passionately to the population. Every world he so visited turned against the rule of Vandir and his cronies, often violently overthrowing those in power. Soon, Thor was at the head of an alliance of planets and forces known as the Confederation of Light. The name had once belonged to a sect of the Imperial cult that preached self-sacrifice, moderation, and generosity, but had been crushed ruthlessly by the dominant faction of the Temple of the Savior Emperor in the early days of the Ecclesiarchy. Dimamar, the homeworld of the sect, had been ruthlessly purged, but the teachings of the Confederation had survived and been resurrected by Thor and his allies. The Temple of the Savior Emperor. After the end of the Roboutian Heresy and the sacrifice of the Emperor, many sects rose that worshipped him as a god. In time, these sects would unite to become the Imperial Creed, preached across the Imperium by the Ecclesiarchy. But this process was far from peaceful. Terrible wars of religion tore the worlds of the Imperium apart, until the Imperium put an end to it by enforcing the power of the Ecclesiarchy, who would ensure that the application of the Imperial Creed as one true and only faith in the Imperium. Even those High Lords and Legion Masters who did not believe in the divinity of the Emperor were forced to accept the creation of the Ecclesiarch's office, seeing a unified religion as the only way to stop the endless and bloody religious conflict. One of the sects who became the foundation of the Ecclesiarchy was known as the Temple of the Savior Emperor. It was the most powerful and influential of all, with entire fleets and planets under its direct control. When the Ecclesiarch's seat was established, it was one of their own who first sat it, and they kept things that way for 5,000 years. Over time, however, the temple changed from being a genuine religion into becoming a tool of power for its leaders. The Ecclesiarch was, in their eyes, the one true ruler of the Imperium by divine right as the voice of the Emperor. This led to the tensions between the Ecclesiarchy and the other High Lords, until eventually Gulch Vandir used the situation to become master of both the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum. Under his reign of blood, the members of the Temple of the Savior Emperor became even more unhinged, after the last honest men among them were purged by the insane High Lord. After the death of Vandir, the members of the temple were hunted down by the Word Bearers and the Night Lords, While Sebastian Thor reformed the ecclesiarchy from within, the two legions purged the last traces of Vandir's blasphemy. However, not all of them were found. The Temple of the Savior Emperor was a powerful sect, and with allies and assets in many places. Several of its leaders escaped justice and reappeared decades later, hidden among the local ecclesiarchy hierarchy under false identities. Known as the Tempo Tendency, they are heretics all who seek personal power and wealth above the well-being and spiritual purity of their followers. They desire the revocation of the decree passive and the restoration of the immense armies of faith that were once theirs to control. The Ordo Hereticus considers it one of its primary missions to destroy the Tempo Tendency and all of its offshoots. Let's continue. If not for the far dire threat possessed by the World Bearers, Vandir would doubtlessly have sent his fleet to eliminate Thor and those who followed him. But with the fleet destroyed by the storms of the Emperor's wrath, the two forces, one made of transhuman warriors and another of mere mortals, arrived to Terra at nearly the same time, from two opposite directions of the galactic plane. For a terrible moment, the World Bearers believed the fleet of Thor had gathered to be under Vandir's control, and their ships' lances prepared to fire and rip through the perceived enemies to pieces. But Thor managed to contact the Legion Master in time and explained that, like the sons of Lorgar, he and his followers had come to bring down Vandir and restore the rightful rule of the God Emperor to the Imperium. Though the World-Bearer commander chaffed at being associated with any scion of the ecclesiarchy, he acknowledged Thor's loyalty. Together, he and the human priest launched their attack on Terra, the first battle the Throne World had seen since the terrible events of the War of the Beast, and before that, the Roboutian Heresy itself. Unwilling to repeat the destruction of these conflicts had inflicted upon Terra, the attackers decided to limit their efforts to Vandir's own palace, standing within the continental spread of the Emperor's zone. But the shields of the Imperial Palace were still up, and as they had been for more than 5,000 years, a direct assault would require a preliminary bombardment. Something neither side of the precarious alliance was willing to ever consider. All attempts to contact Vandir and get him to surrender without further bloodshed had been met with only more insane ramblings, most of which seemed to be directed at persons who were not present. It is unclear whether or not Vandir was even conscious of the presence of the World Bearers and the Confederation of Light. But while the World Bearers and Thor's military council were planning their next move, they received a communication from the surface of Terra. This message came from the leader of the Brides of the Emperor, who had now renamed themselves Daughters of the Emperor again, Alicia Dominica. In the hololytic projection of the Strategium of the Fidelitas Lex, she appeared tall and resplendent, holding in her hand the head of Gorge Vandir. While those present were shocked silent by what they saw, Alicia explained that she had been granted an audience with the Emperor himself by the Custodes, and seen the error of her ways in helping Vandir. She and her coven had turned against their former master, seeing him as the heretic and usurper that he really was. Alicia herself had slain the renegade ecclesiarch, though by her own admittance she doubted he had even noticed her presence when she struck. So lost was he in his delusions. Then she knelt, throwing herself at the mercy of the sons of Lorgar, son of the God Emperor, awaiting judgment for her part in Vandir's atrocities. Reactions among the word-bearers varied. Some were pleasantly surprised. Others disgusted that it had taken so much before the daughters had turned against the tyrant. While others were still calling for the attack, claiming that they needed to seize the occasion to purge the Imperium from the ecclesiarchy once and for all. But Thor spoke quickly and eloquently, and the word-bearers renounced both their assault and to inflicting any punishment on Alicia and her sisters. The death of Vandir ended the reign of blood, but it was far from being the end of the Age of Apostasy. Hundreds of worlds had broken away from the Imperium during his reign, or been lost to various invaders who had slipped beyond the Imperial forces on the front lines. Thor, now the new ecclesiarch, had to reform the Holy Synod, and then travel across the entire Imperium in order to restore order. The pilgrimage lasted for 100 years, and ended with the death of Thor himself soon after he returned to Terra for the first time. His body exhausted beyond the help of juvenile treatments by his endless work, or, some suggest, slain by the hands of jealous members of the ecclesiarchy. Both possible. Before his death, Thor and other High Lords instated the Decree Passive, a commandment that forbids the ecclesiarchy to gather, train, promote, sustain, or in any way command any force of men under arms. However, the daughters of the Emperor, being an order made entirely of women, were not concerned by the letter of that law, and so they became the Adeptus Sororitas. Thor believed that while the ecclesiarchy's previous military might have been curbed, the fate still required warriors to defend it. Though the storms in the warp had receded with the death of Vandir and the defeat of the Imperium's foes, at least for a time, several other tyrants had taken advantage of the confusion to build their own empires, and they too needed to be brought to heel. Greatest of them was the apostate Cardinal Bucaris, who took advantage of his world's isolation to preach that Terra had fallen, and that he was the new leader of mankind. Bucaris preached that only the strong deserve to live, and the weak, which included the poor, the sick, but also the old and the young, which is a wide array, didn't have a place in the galaxy. Every human should fight for himself and follow his own desires. Only that way could mankind as a whole prosper, free from the burden of the weak in its ranks. His empire quickly expanded from the planet of Gahalamar, in the Segmentum Solar, to include almost 50 worlds, some conquered by force, others exposed to the same spiritual decay to which Cardinal himself had succumbed. With the resources, Bucaris built great monuments in his honor and built up military forces under his command. Eventually, however, the news of Bucaris' heresy came to be known, reached the ears of the word-bearers. Barely a few years had passed since the death of Vandir, and the word-bearers were still reeling from the scale of that betrayal. Yet they had been denied the chance to bring Vandir to justice by the intervention of the Custodes and the turning of the daughters of the Emperor. The Legion's blood still ran hot, and when they had heard of Bucaris' treachery, the leader of the 17 saw both a righteous cause and an opportunity to appease the tempers of their brothers. The still gathered might of the Legion came upon Bucaris' empire like the wrath of the Emperor. Within a few months, almost every world conquered by the apostate Cardinal had been reclaimed. Bucaris' forces broke into pieces everywhere they met the word-bearers in combat. Finally, the Legion came to Galtalmor itself. The planet had never been rich in the past, but the plundered wealth of Bucaris' empire had been used to make it a fortress as well as a luxurious capital. But the greedy generals of the Cardinal were no match for the tactical acumen of the legionnaires, and the planet fell in mere 5 days. As the Space Marines descended from the skies, several popular revolts arose from within, led by an elderly confessor named Dolan Quirosius. By the time the champions of the 17th Legion tore through Bucaris' palace, located the fleeing Cardinal, and killed him, they were being cheered by the streets packed with rebellious citizens. Order on Galtalamor was swiftly restored, as a fleet of Imperial reinforcements emerged from the warp in the Word-Bearers' wake, carrying officials and diplomats. The Word-Bearers took advantage of the slight delay before their arrival, however, to violently purge every supporter of Bucaris they could find, regardless of their rank or possible use of the Imperium in the future. This prevented the people of Galtalamor from descending into mob justice. but also left a mark upon the Word-bearers' records that they carry to this day. With the death of Bucharest and the destruction of his empire of lies, the age of apostasy finally came to an end. But the Imperium had been terribly wounded by enemies both external and internal, and the losses suffered during the Dark Age are yet to heal. The Wars of Vindication. Another aspect of the Age of Apostasy. The Wars of Vindication were waged within the ranks of the Ordo Assassinarum, but they also involved the 20th Legion. They erupted soon before the death of Vandir and continued for a period of at least several years. After claiming control of the ecclesiarchy, Vandir still wanted to extend his power further. He especially desired the office of Grand Master of Assassins, for he saw the Officio Assassinorum as the only remaining threat to his power. However, the incumbent Grand Master was impervious to all of Vandir's attempts to bribe him or threaten him to his side. So instead, Vandir cultivated a network among the Officio, turning dozens of assassins and other agents against the Grand Master. Leader of this conspiracy was Zarek, a member of the Kalidus Temple. The plan was that Zarek would kill the Grand Master, then use his shape-shifting abilities to take his place and command the Officio without anyone outside the circle of the conspirators being aware of the change. Vandir died before the plan could be carried out, however. Fearful of retribution being directed at him for his part in the tyrant's reign, Jarek immediately put the plan into action. Though the assassination appeared to be a success, the Grand Master had seen the betrayal coming and ensured that information about it reached the proper ears. Upon his death, both his own loyal servants and the Alpha Legion received detailed reports of Yarrick and his allies within the Officio. What followed was a brutal succession of skirmishes across the entire galaxy, as the sons of Alfarius teamed up with the loyal assassins to purge the Officio of conspirators. Little of it is recorded in the Inquisition archives, and what we know comes only from what assassins who took part in it told us. Weapons that had been locked away in the sealed vaults since the time of the heresy were wielded once more, and entire worlds were lost in cataclysms whose source was never uncovered. In the end, however, Jarek was slain, and the Officio returned under the control of the Imperium. For all the secrecy of the Wars of Vindication, they did come to the attention of the reformed High Lords of Terra. After things had calmed down, it was decided that the power of the Officio needed to be collared, in the same manner as that of the ecclesiarchy had been. From this point onward, every assassination carried out by the temples would require a vote among the High Lords, and the temples would be scattered across the galaxy, rather than focused in a single location, where corruption could spread more easily. The foundation of the Ordo Sicarius was also ordered, to keep watch over the Officio in the future, and according to rumor, on the secretive Alpha Legion as well. It was in the aftermath of this bloody age that the Ordo Hereticus was founded. The corrupt priests and rebellious leaders of the Age of Apostasy had revealed the importance of keeping the spiritual shepherds and political leaders of the Imperium under watch, and the heirs of the Inquisitors who warned the word-bearers of Vandir's true nature became the first members of this order. Over time, its purview would grow to include every form of heresy, including those inspired by chaos, leading to the members of the Ordo Hereticus receiving the nickname of Witch Hunters. Now, 5,000 years after the death of Gauge Vandir, the events of the Age of Apostasy have faded into legend for most Imperial citizens, but the High Lords of Terra still remember how the Sons of Lorgar did not hesitate for a moment to sail towards the throne world in an intent of killing everyone in charge there. According to many savants of the Inquisition, this had both the positive and negative consequences, as it encourages the High Lords to do their best to avoid drawing the ire of the 17, also making the most ruthless among them plot the destruction of the entire legion.